African nations from Mozambique to Nigeria have condemned the xenophobic attacks in South Africa. But President Jacob Zuma insists his country is not against foreigners. So what's behind these attacks and how will they impact South Africa? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. A wave of xenophobic attacks against migrant workers has exposed the deep tensions that still exist in South African society more than 20 years after the fall of apartheid. The sight of Africans killing fellow Africans jars with the image of a rainbow nation as described by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And it's provoked a period of intense self-reflection and condemnation, as well as debate about what role ethnicity, tribalism and continued poverty and inequality play in modern South Africa. Before we get into our discussion, Charles Stratford reports on how the violence is also straining the country's ties with the rest of Africa.
I'm here in an area of Johannesburg that's locally known as Little Lagos because of the sheer amount of Nigerian businesses that are operated from here and the amount of Nigerians that live in this area. Now, you speak to people here and there's still a lot of fear and apprehension about these attacks, these xenophobic attacks that we've seen in South Africa recently. And more importantly, seemingly at this stage, there seems to be a developing diplomatic spat. The Nigerian ambassador has been called back to Abuja by the Nigerian government. The South African government described the move as unfortunate, and they have since spoken about what they describe as the importance of sisterly relations between South Africa, Nigeria and the wider African continent. So not only has this caused serious pressure, these attacks caused serious pressure on the South African government both domestically, but it's now having a serious impact on the international stage. Now, Nigeria has emerged as one of South Africa's key economic partners on the continent. Bilateral trade between the two countries now reaching into the billions of dollars a year and increasing all the time. Now, there are some analysts here that say that this row is more to do with rivalry between the two countries as they jostle for influence on the African continent. But there have also been fears about South African businesses operating in Nigeria, also fears about retaliatory attacks by Nigerians on those businesses, a number of businesses closing temporarily over the last couple of weeks. Now, other countries in the region, Zimbabwe for example, Malawi, Mozambique, their governments have also widely condemned these attacks, and they've been offering buses for the repatriation of workers that want to go back home, that are literally too scared to stay in South Africa now. It's also important to recognise, though, that there have been talks on a diplomatic level between the South African government and a number of other African governments across the continent over the last couple of weeks, really since these attacks started, to try and calm the situation. It's just an indication here of just how serious these attacks have become across the continent on a diplomatic level for this country. Charles Stratford for Inside Story in Johannesburg.
Let's bring in our guests in Johannesburg. Simon Allison, Africa editor for Daily Maverick. He is also a consultant for the Institute of Security Studies. Joining us via Skype from Pretoria is Andrew Asamoah, senior researcher at the Institute of Security Studies. And in Johannesburg as well, Eusebius McKaiser, political analyst and social commentator. Welcome to the program. Let me start off with you, Eusebius McKaiser. How big a diplomatic crisis is this between Nigeria and South Africa?
I don't think it's a crisis that is insurmountable. I suppose it's melodramatic in the context of diplomatic language that is usually very subtle. And I was quite frankly surprised that the South African government, that is not particularly well known for responding in adversarial tone to fellow African countries, that it came up with this particular statement. I think to some extent it was justified. The South African government has been running out of patience with the Nigerian government for a long while. When we lost citizens in Nigeria, they were very tardy uncooperative, and took a while before bodies were repatriated. And I think also on some level, the South African state feels that when private citizens engage in xenophobic acts, that really isn't in the first instance a legal failure on the part of the government. So to recall an acting High Commissioner is in effect to impute blame legally and morally to the state. So that's the context of it. But quite frankly, I think it's probably a minor storm in a diplomatic teacup. Come a couple of days, and certainly once we have a new government in place in Nigeria, there'll be renewed attempts to try and cozy up again to the new government in Nigeria.
Simon, what do you make of those comments? A diplomatic storm or a minor crisis?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to actually clarify is that the Nigerian ambassadors were not recalled. This was a statement actually made by this in the South African response. They said that Nigeria had recalled its ambassadors. If you look at what the Nigerians have actually said, is that they have just asked their ambassadors to return home for a consultation about the xenophobic violence in South Africa. This is still a diplomatic censure, but it is a far lesser insult, a far lesser statement than than a recall of the ambassadors. So there's a lot of misinformation going on about this, and it's an indication of how defensive the South African government is taking this. You had President Jacob Zuma a few days ago responding personally to an open letter published by a Mozambican author, and now you've got this over-the-top reaction to what the Nigerians are doing with their ambassadors. It seems that they are trying to fight fires with as many words as they can, and I'm not sure it's doing their image any good. It just makes the country look a little bit defensive and a little bit insecure in its own position.
Andrew, what do you think the consequence of these actions will be on both countries now?
No, I think the issues rather strains the relationship between the two countries because it provides, another level of difficulty within which the two countries will have to find a formula of relating. There have been several instances where many have raised suspicions about the strained relationship. So in this particular case, if you look at, I do agree with Simon that, the response appears to be too harsh from the South African side. I think one needed to also understand that Nigeria as a country also need to hear from their ambassador on the ground. I think the response and the way it's being worded and all of that seems to suggest that Nigeria, has totally recalled the ambassador, and in which sense it becomes a totally different understanding of the situation, which raises suspicions as to whether, as the first speaker indicated, South Africa had, issues already. And so this is providing a trigger. So the way it's being handled provides, another layer of difficulty. But given the fact that these are two leading countries in Africa, they have no option than to work together. And so it makes it more difficult for them to find a reason to work together in leading the continent. And that is how I see it.
Simon, you brought up Zuma's sort of passionate response to a Mozambican poet. He also spoke out quite passionately about those who criticize the South African government, but their citizens are in our country, in South Africa. Does he have a point about that? How can you point fingers when so many of your people are in our country?
It's a very good question, and it's actually very disturbing rhetoric from the president, because instead of saying, yes, we know this is a problem, it's absolutely unacceptable and we are dealing with it, he's saying, yes, we have a problem, but actually it's your problem and you should be doing something about it. It's not just our fault. He seems to be trying to deflect blame. And what I worry about is that this feeds into the idea of xenophobia. It feeds into the idea that these foreigners in South Africa should not be here, they're not allowed to be here, and we are not obligated under international law to treat them humanely which of course we are obligated, and we've signed all of the relevant international law statutes that govern the movement of people across borders and refugees, and the South African state has an obligation to look after these people, and right now we're not living up to that obligation.
Eusebius, if that is the sentiment of the South African government, that they're not obligated to look after foreigners under international law, what sort of pressure then can be put on South Africa to adhere to this international law and to change its viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Simon, and I've said it on another international platform that indeed the South African government, it's also the reason why they avoided the use of the word xenophobia initially. It was an attempt to deflect the moral and legal obligations in international law. What I would say, however, is that perhaps the failure in the examples that you've pointed to in terms of what President Zuma has said in his response to a writer from Mozambique, and more recently speaking to the continent at large about the fact that our immigration challenge is in part their challenge, is that the president is not quite off the mark in terms of the basic point that he wants to make. The failure is that South Africans, quite frankly, as a state, we're not very good at the diplomacy game. The correct version, or the more palatable version of the message that really sounded as off, as Simon correctly caricatures it, is what he wanted to say is that when it comes to cross-border movements across the region, it is a collective African challenge. And if I was his advisor or someone in international relations in South Africa, I would have urged the president to make the same claim, but to frame his language differently so that he invites a conversation geopolitically inside the African Union, perhaps, first and foremost, about what we as Africans will do collectively. So I don't think that his remarks are beyond rescue, but certainly his chosen language deserves the kind of criticism you've heard on this platform. But to answer you directly, just in 30 seconds, there is moral suasion that the state cannot ignore. The reality is that South Africans have done so well. I'm feeling warm and fuzzy just giving you examples. People in their thousands marching to express disgust with xenophobia and Afrophobia, letters being written to the state, columnists, folks calling in to talk radio stations. So it's very difficult to quantify, but I think everyone who has been watching the scenario over the last couple of weeks will be mindful of the fact that the South African government is under enormous internal pressure because civil society and ordinary citizens have distanced themselves from the xenophobia. Of course, whether it is restricted to a couple of folks who are bad apples or whether there is a xenophobia problem at the heart of South African society, including amongst middle-class South Africans, that we can debate. But certainly the state will be feeling the public relations pressure and the moral pressure from tens of thousands of South Africans.
Okay, you talk about the xenophobic problem and the problem of violence in South Africa, and Jacob Zuma was talking about that when he addressed the issue during a ceremony to mark 21 years since the country's first democratic election.
We strongly condemn these attacks. They have no place in our democracy, where people are free to express their unhappiness about any issue. We also urge our communities to isolate criminal elements who perpetuate such horrendous crimes against fellow human beings.
Andrew, he talks about the violence and of course we know that there's so much of that in South Africa, not only limited to the xenophobic violence. Why do you think it is so rampant in South Africa? Is it, as Zuma puts it down, to the legacy of apartheid, or is there something more going on here?
I think there are a number of issues. One is, ignorance at certain levels, because it's not every person at the level of these xenophobic attacks who understands the role that immigrants play in any country they are in. Also, there are issues around the wide divide between haves and have-nots, and the lack of answers on the part of many of the people on the street to generate reasons for all of these, and the fact that immigrants are sometimes easy targets for providing explanatory variables as to why they are not getting jobs and as to why they are not asking certain leaders in the country why there aren't enough jobs, for people to get to work on. And then also the whole issue about suspicion surrounding the lack of integration of immigrant communities into South African, the host communities, and that is a huge challenge. So a number of all these issues, put together, manifest differently in different communities. But as well, one can also point to sometimes even business rivalry at certain levels and some criminal mobilizations around that to try and get certain people in certain businesses off the street so that they can take over. So these manifest in different forms and shapes in different places.
Simon, how much of this violence do you think is linked to the economic slowdown underway in South Africa?
I'm not sure that it's directly linked to the slowdown. I think that the conditions sort of necessary for this kind of violence have been around for a long time, and it's a lot to do with the failure 21 years after the end of apartheid to provide enough jobs, enough education, enough economic opportunities and service delivery to the South African people. The ANC should, of course, take some of the blame, but not all of the blame. They had a huge task on their hands when they took over power, and they have delivered in some respects, and this also needs to be recognized. But I think one thing that we miss in looking at the xenophobic stuff is the type of people that end up in South Africa. The foreigners here are often described as desperate or from marginalized and from hugely disadvantaged backgrounds. And actually, when you look at it, that's not always true. The people that have made it all this way from their home countries through great perils and great difficulty are often people with the best education in their countries and enough of a resource base to make that trip possible. And when they arrive, they often fit into networks of other immigrants, into immigrant communities that are able to provide them with basics such as startup loans for small business. And these are crucial factors in why immigrants that end up in South Africa tend to do very well in the informal job market, because they have the skills and resources necessary to set up small businesses, to make themselves attractive for informal labor opportunities. And the great failure of the new South Africa is that we have not necessarily made all of our own people as attractive in that way.
Eusebius, you were shaking your head there. What do you disagree with?
Yeah, I disagree with Simon. I mean, Simon is partly right, so it's not deep disagreement. I just don't think he's given you the full picture. Let me put it this way, and I don't have a crystal ball in my pocket. I'd bet my left kidney that if you had full employment in South Africa, we'd still be a violent society. We might, in that scenario, have fewer attacks on foreign nationals, less Afrophobia, less xenophobia, but we will still be a deeply violent South Africa. And the reason is that the shopping list of factors that more fully account for why violence is in our blood in South Africans do not only restrict itself to economic analysis and in particular unemployment. Inequality, for example, correlates in social science research more reliably with gratuitous acts of violence in South Africa than unemployment. That means the gap between the haves and the have-nots is actually a worse ticking time bomb for us than how many people are employed, to the extent that one can really disaggregate unemployment from inequality. Then to your question, President Zuma is partly right. It doesn't excuse missed opportunities, but he's absolutely right that in a sense the scars of apartheid are with us. Now at this point, pessimists about the country will roll their eyes, but I'm afraid they're wrong. The reality is that if you have had for decades, and quite frankly for centuries, a police state oppressing the black African majority, we became used to violence as the norm through which to communicate with each other. The state communicated that way with us. We communicate that way with each other domestically. And so the list of factors that combine to explain why South Africa is violent, endemically violent, are true statements, are many. And to try and reduce it to lost opportunities in unemployment is to give an incredibly partial account of the overall picture, and that is not to excuse missed opportunities over the last 21 years for the state to have done more. But the reality is that even if the ANC was perfect, was an A-rated student, we would still have the structural and psychological legacy of a police state haunting us in the way in which we engage one another, let alone foreign nationals.
Okay, and the impact of that, the violence on the streets, the violence on impacts, is having an effect on business, of course. South African leaders and business owners are worried about the impact that these attacks could have on the economy. South Africa exports some $21 billion of goods to other African nations. Last week, a deputy minister for trade and industry suggested the country had already lost tens of millions of dollars in export revenue since the attacks began. There have been calls for a boycott of South African products in Mozambique, Malawi and Zambia. And petrochemicals company Sasol was forced to move 340 of its South African workers in Mozambique last week. This is not a good time for this, is it, Andrew?
I think you're right. It's not a good time. I think that if you look at what South Africa stands to lose from that angle of the businesses in other countries, is quite huge. And I think that is the more reason why some people thought that the initial response and condemnation should have been swift, rather than the initial semantics and the arguments around that we saw as to whether it was criminality or xenophobic attacks. But be that as it may, I think that at the moment you asked about even the sort of pressure that can cause South Africa to really do something. I feel that the kind of pressure that is coming from these on the South African side is quite high. And I think that South Africa will need to really be robust in terms of the response, in terms of engaging other African countries. Clearly on one issue that Simon raised, that yes, this is a very unfortunate time in South Africa's history. What is happening is not necessarily reflective of the South African government's position. Some of these are being done at the private levels, and so the governments will have to engage at that level and find a solution, a consistent solution. And so South Africa's body language in condemning and coming across in all of these will have to be consistent with what the condemnation of all of these. Because at the end of the day, the foreign migrants will suffer, but South Africa also stands a chance of suffering hugely, as we've already seen emerging in some of the countries that you raised.
As Eusebius was saying, one forgets how many good South Africans there are, those who take to the streets, who demonstrate against the xenophobic violence. But sadly, in the media at the moment, Simon, as you know, the stories about South Africa are not good, are they? The arrogant foreign policy, the problems within the ANC, the amount of money that Zuma spends on his private residence. I know that you fear that South Africa is becoming a pariah state once more. Why is that?
I'm not sure I'd go that far. It's an interesting question to ask, just as a thought experiment, but there's a long way to go before South Africa actually becomes a pariah state. Having said that, our diplomacy needs a lot of work. I think that our diplomats are still too prone to go for off-the-cuff, knee-jerk reactions that often inflame situations rather than calm them. And I am worried that we seem to be intent on pursuing a very solitary foreign policy, pursuing only, things that seem to work in our narrow self-interest. And I know that's how states work, but this is a continent that was founded on the premise of Pan-Africanism and strength in unity. And to abandon that at this stage seems like a tragedy in its own right. And in terms of the xenophobic things in particular, I think that we must be careful not to think of this as a uniquely South African problem. If we look at the continent as a whole, right now, people on the move, migrants on the move, are being targeted at every corner of the continent. We've got people drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get to Europe. We've got the Kenyan government threatening to shut down the largest refugee camp in the world. And in South Africa, we've got this spate of xenophobic attacks. These are not unrelated incidents. Africa's migrants, Africa's people on the move, are the most vulnerable amongst us, but they are often the most resourceful and entrepreneurial amongst us as well. And I think as a continent, we'd be far better served by welcoming them and encouraging them rather than making their lives as difficult as possible.
Let's leave on those positive words, that outreach to foreigners in South Africa by Simon Allison in Johannesburg. Thank you too to Andrew Asamoah in Pretoria, and also in Johannesburg, Eusebius McKaiser. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. You can get in touch with us on our program page at aljazeera.com. Post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us. Go to @AJ Inside Story or @Jane Dutton. And I am Jane Dutton from all of the team here. Goodbye for now. Thanks for watching.